start off with, I'd just like to introduce myself and Karen from the Tech Talent Charter, and also Emma Rich from Coex. And we were the folks who will be leading this session around accent bias and looking at what this means in practice, what's the research say about accent bias, how does it manifest, and what can we do about it? So that's kind of the overview of this session, really. So looking at accent bias, there has been a long history of prestige hierarchy when it comes to accents in the UK. And there's been recent research that came out at the end of 2022, really revealing how much accent continues to be an influencing factor in the way we think and make decisions about all sorts of things. But in particular, we're looking at how this affects decisions around hiring, jobs, from a diversity, inclusion, and equity point of view. So looking at this research, there are some really stark statistics that emerge here. Like, for instance, the fact that 1 in 4 senior individuals in organisations have been singled out for their accent, have faced kind of mockery or uncomfortable situations as a result of having an accent that is perceived to be non-normal in the environment that they are in. And we know that many of our signatories have a really key focus here on looking at diversity and inclusion, particularly at senior levels. That's emerged as a really key theme amongst our signatory base. So with that in mind, we wanted to explore the research a bit further in this session, and get a bit of a view of how does this manifest? Where are the potential risk factors within a talent strategy, within an employee life cycle, where these challenges can be a greater risk? And what can we do to try and offset those as practitioners in HR, people, and diversity and inclusion teams? So with that in mind, I'd love to first invite Emma, who is our guest speaker from one of our signatories today, to introduce herself and just give us a view of kind of why did you get in touch with Tech Talent Charter and go, yeah, we need to be talking about accent bias?
Hello, everybody. I'm Emma Rich. I'm the Strategic Operations Director at Coex Global Limited. So just a bit of background on Coex. We're a consultancy business and we specialise in tech and people change. And in order to deliver successful change for our clients, we absolutely need to make sure that we've got the best teams delivering that change. And we absolutely fundamentally believe that the best teams are diverse teams. So whether that's ethnicity or whether it's gender or whether it's background, I think, you know, all these factors play into having a far more diverse thought within a team. And it's really important to us at Coex that we have the best teams to deliver change for our clients. Personally, away from Coex, I'm also a working mum, and you can tell by my accent that I'm, depending on where other people live, some people call me a southerner and some people call me a northerner, but I think that kind of puts me in I'm a Midlander really, but I think Midlanders actually always say I'm a northerner. So yeah, so this is absolutely something that's I've had a career over 25 years or so now, and it's something that I feel quite strongly about. You know, where do you fit? How are you perceived? What are the opportunities that you get given or not given based on your accent? So yeah, for all those reasons, I reached out to the Tech Talent Charter, and Coex are a very proud signatory of the Tech Talent Charter.
Great, thank you, Emma. So I guess with that in mind, let's kick off first with a bit of a discussion around how does accent manifest as a bias in the workplace, and just a couple of things for us to kind of cover off, because this is, broadly speaking, a less well understood, less discussed, less visible area of practice from a diversity and inclusion point of view. The first few things to take note of are that everyone has an accent. It's not other people having accents and you don't, which can sometimes be an attitude that emerges, particularly in certain types of environments where there's a very homogenous type of demographic. Everyone has an accent and everyone has bias. That's the other thing to say. So when we talk about accent bias, what we're talking about here when we're talking about trying to fix this is fixing the way that this can emerge in harmful stereotypes. But there's also the other side of it, of acknowledging that everyone has this bias, everyone has unconscious bias, everyone has an accent, and that those two things will remain true and are also okay. And it's about how we can position this wider issue in a way that we can then focus on ways to offset and suppress unconscious bias where it can be harmful. So the thing about accent, of course, is that whilst we've all got them, and they're not necessarily a protected characteristic in the same way gender and ethnicity might be, and might be regarded by HR teams and D&I programs of practice, they do signal different protected characteristics. So even though, you know, you might be going, oh, well, is this just another lens, another extension of diversity and inclusion practice, which can be an objection that gets raised or a question that gets asked when we try to look at, should we be even considering accent? Why are we talking about it? It does have this very strong signaling factor for characteristics that are protected, such as ethnicity and race, for example. So with that in mind, I'd love to kind of kick it to you, Emma, to ask from your point of view and your experiences, which we've talked about in the past, how have you seen accent bias and accent stereotyping emerging in the workplace?
So I've been thinking about this as prep for the call, and I've worked in lots of different places around the UK, and as I mentioned previously, when I've worked in Chester, I've lived in Leeds, I've worked in Newcastle upon Tyne, and in all those places, I would be called a Southerner because of my accent. And then now I live down south, and I'm in London quite a lot. I've lived in Brighton, and people down in the south would say, "Oh, you're a Northerner." And so I think, you know, I'm from Stoke originally, very proud Potter, and I think sometimes you can be left feeling, well, you know, what's wrong with my identity? You know, what's wrong with the way I speak? If you don't speak in the dominant accent of where you're living or where you're working, you can feel quite different. And I think that can, fortunately, I think I'm quite resilient, and over the 25 years, I've now become quite used to the comments. But I think, you know, I particularly am concerned about the younger generation who are coming through and perhaps don't have that resilience, or, you know, individuals who may not have that resilience. And so I think it can be quite ostracizing for people to feel that they're different and that they're having some kind of judgment made on the way that they speak. I really think that we should be far more concerned in the words that people say rather than the accent in which someone says it. I think, interestingly, very often, you know, we can often think it's a north-south thing, but I don't think that's right. You know, I've got the joy of working with a whole load of lovely people who are from Essex at the moment, and you know, work with an amazing team. But there's a real theme in the team that I work in at the moment where, you know, people from Essex are perceived as not being as intelligent, for example, as someone who speaks, you know, kind of BBC English. So I don't think it is always a northern accent. I mean, obviously, you know, we kind of think about the stronger accents, maybe from Liverpool or Leeds, Manchester, you know, the northeast, Scotland, you know, Glaswegian accent. We can think about those accents, but I don't think it is necessarily just limited to northern accents. I've actually got a friend who is also from Stoke. She's a very senior marketing director, and I was horrified to hear that she has been actually mocked in the middle of a presentation by her peers. So in Stoke, you know, we would traditionally say that the very strong double O sound, like a book or Luke. And when she was presenting, people actually started to laugh at the way she was speaking. I mean, I think that's just horrific. I don't think anybody should be subject to that. Unfortunately, someone kind of, you know, protected her and said, well, can you know, stop doing that? But for people to think that's okay, I think we need to raise the issue of accent bias to a higher level. It really does make people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think what you've highlighted there are some really key things that also are reflected in the research that we've seen. So the first one is that there is this hierarchy, and there are accents that do better and do less well on that accent hierarchy. And you've referred to estuary English, for example, which is one of the accents that does face a harsher stereotype. Right at the bottom of the list in terms of perceptions of the widest audience are things like multicultural urban English accents, and so there is this kind of very clear ranking which relates to geography. So whilst we're talking about accent bias here quite generally, it's important to recognise that this happens in a geographical and situational context, and that certain office locations may face different views of what this challenge looks like, and particularly in the tech industry, which has very, very high multicultural demographics. When we look at ethnicity, there are considerations we need to factor in here, given that multicultural urban English accents do feature at the kind of lower end when people are asked to determine what they perceive competence to sound like in an accent. So there's this really interesting thing here about like understanding what is the actual prestige hierarchy. Now you can find that prestige hierarchy. There's some really great research out there by the Sutton Trust and by Accent Bias in Britain, which are two fantastic resources to look at, which will show what the accent hierarchy looks like. And there are some quite interesting ones there. So for instance, you've got received pronunciation, which has for the last, I think, 50 years, that's stats at the top of the rankings in terms of the perception of competence that is associated with a particular accent. But also you've got some funny outliers there, like French accents. English are perceived to be high prestige accents as well. So there's some interesting things there to dig out that's worth taking a look at if you haven't looked at accent prestige and the actual hierarchy that currently exists and that has been largely static for the last 50 years. There's something else that, Emma, you mentioned there as well, which came out of the research that emerged at the end of last year as well, which is to do with age. And there was a fantastic, really interesting piece within this research that was highlighting how perceptions of competence and stereotyping linked to accent change depending on the age of the listener. So there's a kind of a real watershed at 45. So listeners over the age of 45 are significantly sort of downgrading the perceived competence of a potential job candidate based on accent, particularly, for instance, if we were looking at that urban multicultural accent, that was considered to be significantly less competent in terms of how it was perceived. So there is this really interesting thing here about the idea of becoming more normative as you age, as you accrue experiences of what is the norm. That starts to factor into potential creation of biases that then can come out. Now, the reason I bring this up is that obviously leadership are people who are in leadership roles are typically going to be more likely to be more experienced in their careers. And we're obviously looking at diversity and inclusion here from the point of view of not just hiring, but also who gets promoted, which is another key issue area for a lot of our signatories. So with that in mind, I thought that was a really interesting one, Emma, the idea that we have to look at this very much from like a contextual age lens, not only from the point of view of the perceptions, but also the experience that folks have. So we know that from this research, for example, that university students and people who are early on in their career experience a lot more anxiety about their accents. And that dovetails with other research that's emerged that shows that folks who've just graduated from university are more likely to, in the case of LGBTQ plus identity, for example, they're more likely to go back into the closet when they actually join a workforce when they've been out previously. So there was this really interesting moment for early in career individuals where anxiety is really high about what their characteristics and traits say about them to others. So I'd love to bring you in, Emma, here at this point on this issue around age, and Karen as well, because you've got some interesting thoughts around age here too, and how it intersects with this idea of accent stereotyping and bias.
Yeah, definitely. I think that one of the other things that the research looked at, and some other professionals have kind of taken a bit of a further angle on, is looking at the not just accent but the use of language and how that then plays into further disadvantaging groups by their accent. And that, when we think about the linguistic choices that people make, that then further often proves prejudice from this research. And I think that adds this another layer in, and while we're trying to build better intergeneration work practices, it's something we have to consider, that we don't underplay that other people's linguistic choices shouldn't be perceived to be better or worse than another's because of their kind of the age demographic that they come from.
Yeah, one of the things that we do at Coex is coach our clients quite a lot in terms of their people practices and how we can make sure that, you know, they're demonstrating best practice to anybody that's looking to either join the organisation or is moving through the organisation. Believe it or not, we do have clients who say we don't want anybody. I mean, this just, you know, shows ignorance, really. We don't want anybody working for us who has an accent. What on earth does that mean? So we, you know, it's absolutely shocking. But you know, we give our employees, our team, the power to challenge that. Even though they're a client of ours, we have to challenge what they're thinking. You know, what do they mean? Is there a need for a particular type of accent? Is there a need for, you know, I don't really know what they mean with this. We try and talk to them about the culture that they're trying to achieve, or the outputs they're trying to achieve, to get the right people. And then we say it's not because of the accent, it's the skills that somebody has.
And I think that this is the problem also, if we consider that as the starting point for some organisations, how are they going to manage perhaps someone that's non-verbal? When we think about our neurodivergent communities, you are immediately, if people can't even value a difference in accent, they're certainly not going to be open and willing to support someone that is non-verbal. So this, although we talk about accents today, I think that where we see this type of behaviour, it's likely that we will see this type of challenge across the board for other lenses of kind of challenge here.
Yeah, thank you both, Karen and Emma. With this, we've kind of talked a little bit about how is this manifesting, and I'd love to kind of move that, I guess, to a question of what are the ethics of using accents in strategic decision making, which is something that Emma, you and I talked about, and you've just alluded to that your clients are potentially doing. They are making decisions about their business based on accents. You know, is that right? Is that wrong? What do we think of that? And actually, I'd be really interested to see if others have a view on this. So I think you have an example, don't you, from a client that you'd worked with?
Yeah, so it was a business that I worked with. It was quite a few years ago now, but they made a conscious decision to establish a call centre, a customer care call centre in Sunderland, because the accent was perceived to be friendly and welcoming and caring. And I've got to be honest, I'm a bit split on this, because I don't think anybody should be positively discriminated. You know, if people in Sunderland have a better way of giving customer care, then absolutely, I'm all for it. But I also think that accent bias is so closely linked to the whole socioeconomic representation, that in that way, I think it is a positive, because what you generally find is that where companies are investing because of someone's accent, it probably is in somewhere like a Cardiff, Liverpool, Manchester, the Northeast, Glasgow, and they are the areas that need investment. You know, the government talk about the Great North and the investments going into the north of England, and I think so. On that basis, you know, we've seen some of the big media companies move up to Salford, and that's been hugely positive for that area and the whole economy of the area. And so I think on some way, on a kind of greater scale, you know, more of a macro level, I think that investment in areas because of the accent leads to positivity. Although I don't think people should be positively discriminated because of their accent. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting point here around, you know, businesses are currently making these strategic decisions to plant in certain areas, and I guess it's that question of, if you're going to do that, are you also going to ensure you're investing your full talent strategy within that area, and you're bringing all of the different employee supports and engagements and leadership roles as well, so that it's not being based around a certain perception of competence and a certain type of role, but actually the whole plethora of roles within your organisation are also being seeded in that region. So it's a really interesting one. Karen, I'd love to kind of pull you in on this one as well too, just from your experience and your point of view.
Yeah, I think we do see that people will make these strategic decisions, and I think we're on ethically quite dodgy ground when we use any bias to inform our business decisions. So I think that, you know, we must, as you said, Lexi, if that is a decision, it needs to be on more than accent alone. It needs to be that they're going to bring the investment, make sure there's progression, and bring the whole, and look that actually there's talent, wonderful talent in the regions across the UK, and that's not something we should hinge on an accent decision. Because what does that mean in terms of our communities that live in these areas? We will only recruit people that sound a certain way. Well, then we're really baking in all of the prejudice that we are trying to sort of fight against, and preventing, you know, those local economies from thriving and having all of that wonderful difference within the community as well.
Yeah, what you've hit on there actually is really interesting, Karen, because I actually contacted the researchers of the Speaking Up report from Sutton that was published by Sutton Trust. So I spoke to Professor Devyani Sharma, and I asked her this question and said to her, well, what is your view on it? And she said exactly what you've highlighted there, Karen, which is that there is a corporate advantage. There's no denying that companies will exploit any corporate advantage that they can in the nature of competitive business to make sure that they're providing value from whatever it is that they're doing. And that makes it very difficult to challenge this as a practice. But what can be really helpful is making sure that businesses are aware that that is what they are doing, so that by leveraging a particular effect of a certain accent, you are further entrenching stereotypes about that accent. And making that really clear within businesses to key stakeholders and to decision makers is a really helpful thing to do, was her point of view. She had like the 3 suggestions really for organisations that might be doing this kind of thing. And the first and most important one is just making sure that you are raising awareness so that this doesn't fall into an unconscious bias territory. Like, if we're going to use it, it should be conscious, it should be something we're aware of. And if that's a call that someone is going to take, they should be working to then offset that and suppress the outcomes of it. So there was this idea of raising the awareness of unconscious bias, adding just 2 minutes of training to existing D&I training materials is enough to kind of shift and how recruiters flag to themselves that they might be making decisions, and how other decision makers might be leveraging biases that they have that they're not aware of. So there's all of these different approaches that you can take if that is the corporate decision that ends up being the outcome of something like that. So I guess we've talked a little bit here about, you know, how is this manifesting? What does it feel like from a personal point of view? And what are some of the kind of commercial ways that this can emerge? But I'd love us to move on to really, I guess, if we're going to try and make improvements around this area of practice and the ways that it can potentially be causing harm and limit those, what does that look like? So I'd love to kick this to you, Emma, to ask, if we're going to talk more positively about accent and try and redress some of the issues that emerge with accent bias, what should you be doing, and what is Coex doing?
So, as I said previously, you know, we do huge amounts in Coex to raise everyone's awareness. And one of the big things that I think we've tried to promote is being able to call each other out on, in a nice way, in a positive way, to call each other out when we see something that's not right. And that might be around accent, it might be around, you know, any comment. But I think it takes, especially when you're in a business where you've got, you know, the new generation coming through, and they might be a bit nervous, you know, I don't want to say that to somebody who's a bit older than me, or it's about giving people confidence and empowerment to say, actually, that's made me feel uncomfortable, or you know, have you thought about that might make someone else feel uncomfortable? So we're really trying to foster this open, constructive environment where we can hold each other to account. And I think particularly with accent, people very often don't mean anything harmful by their comments. I think very often, my experience certainly has been, people are generally trying to be quite friendly in the things that they say, but actually sometimes it can be received in a way that makes you feel like, oh, not this again. oh, okay, I'm the token northerner in the room, or it can make you feel quite singled out. So at Coex, we're trying to foster this environment. Everybody can speak up, and we're also looking at putting some software into our HR system so that people can kind of do this anonymously. So if they do feel a little bit self-conscious of raising their hand and speaking up, that they can kind of tell somebody that they've seen this behaviour, and they can do that anonymously. We're also doing an awful lot of unconscious bias training. So I don't think people really think about accents because it's in our daily lives. We encounter so many different people with so many different accents. I don't think people spend a lot of time thinking about what do I think when I hear somebody talk to me in a non-dominant voice. So as part of our D&I training, we're trying to bring accent bias to the forefront to say that does bring in judgments, and everybody will have those judgments. But if you can recognise them, you can then almost do away with them.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a great place for me to jump in here, because I looked at what the data shows us is effective at combating accent bias. And actually that last point that you've made is the simplest and the most effective way at combating accent bias. Whilst unconscious bias training has mixed results, it's been shown to have mixed results for other lenses of practice. This is one area where it is very clearly shown to work well. There are hypotheses that that there is people can develop a fatigue around certain topics of unconscious bias training, and that can result in potentially counterproductive effects. But with accent bias, because it's still very much considered something that's acceptable, people are still very comfortable expressing kind of biases and stereotypes around accent. This is where unconscious bias training can really make a huge effort, and it's something that luckily we're all quite familiar with from a diversity and inclusion point of view now. If you know about diversity and inclusion, you know the term unconscious bias training. That's a fairly well-known idea. And the good thing is that is the most impactful thing that you can do. So if there's only one thing you take away from this call about addressing this issue, that's what you can start with. And it can be, so in the tests that have been run, it can be as simple as a small box that appears next to a candidate's name in an application that says, this person has this type of accent, just flagging that the accent is something that you may be hearing, and actually assigning meaning to in ways that you weren't expecting. So it can be a very, very simple change here that can be the most effective intervention that you can use. There are some other really interesting things, though, that the research shows that are actually, I think, really promising and a lot of cause for hope here. So when we think about accent, we've been talking here about how, this can have really damaging effects, and it is true, but there are also some really good ways to overcome it. And actually there's a lot of ability that is evidenced in the research that shows that people can do this really well and very naturally. So there are two key things that can actually displace accent bias and essentially suppress it very effectively, and those two things are expert knowledge and confidence. So if a candidate or a person in your team who's going for promotion is nervous, has nervousness about their accent, then the two things that you can get them to focus on are displaying lots of expert knowledge, which is brilliant in tech, because that sits so wonderfully against tech talent pipelines and what we're trying to do in terms of bringing more people into the tech talent pipeline and filling the kind of digital skills gap. So there is this really wonderful opportunity within tech for us to start challenging accent bias in a way that maybe other professions aren't able to do. So for instance, law and finance, which have been two areas that have really emerged amongst our signatories who are talking about this. Those are areas that may find it potentially harder or less immediately available to challenge in this way with expert knowledge, potentially. Obviously, I'm making sweeping statements here, but I think tech is a really good opportunity in which folks can very easily demonstrate expert knowledge. So it's a great place for us to start, and we should be the leaders in this conversation. And that second one is about confidence. So saying something confidently it can actually just completely displace any effect that accent may have on the listener. And I think that's a really important thing to share, particularly for cascading out to our management and leadership teams. We do often hear this whole piece about, particularly for instance from a gender diversity point of view, that we need women to be more confident, and there's been this narrative as well around oh, you know, why do you keep trying to fix women by making them more confident? And there are lots of sides to this wider conversation about confidence more broadly. But this is one example where confidence has been proven to be helpful in raising the apparent competence of an individual. And it's particularly relevant for accent because accent is tied to how we communicate. So with that in mind, if you're having these conversations about how managers can better support, mentor, lead, champion their colleagues, what we're looking at here is helping those individuals to understand that confidence is really important. If someone is nervous about their accent, and actually mumbling because you're embarrassed of your accent is kind of like a compounding factor that reflects how other people perceive you. Now, I know that that's this is centering it on the individual, but accent is a deeply individual part of identity. Some people are very comfortable with having accents that aren't in keeping with the majority group of their context, and others are not. So with that in mind, it's good to have this information and be armed with it. That leads really to my third and final piece that I'd love to highlight from the research that we've seen, which is to do with code switching. So I was just mentioning there this idea of some people are very comfortable with their accent and other people are not as comfortable with their accents. And what we know is that folks may choose to modify their accent in favour of the group that they are in. So modify it in favour of making it closer to the in-group traits rather than out-group traits. And with this idea of code switching, whilst we want to support colleagues to feel confident with whatever accent they bring with them to work and to life, it's a choice. It's not something that people have to relate to and say, I'm gonna, you know, this is a big part of me that I'm gonna always hang on to, because accents change and people are free to choose what they want to do with their accent. So code switching does exist, and it's totally fine for individuals to choose that if they would like to. But what's really important is that as workplaces, we need to make sure it's not an expectation. And I think that's where it starts to get into that really difficult ground that we see in professions like law, for example, where there may be tacit, unspoken expectations, like for instance in Emma with your client that you were mentioning there, the expectation that people need to code switch. It needs to be okay for people to elect to do it, but the culture of the organisation needs to preserve the fact that diversity is really important. And it's really important, again, if we link back to the issues that we were seeing with older listeners, we need to make sure that we're providing a diversity of different accents around our workforce, because that helps to dispel some of the stereotypes that have been harming these types of perceptions of competence historically. So those were, I guess, the kind of the key things that emerged there from that research around what has the greatest effect. It's about unconscious bias training, raising awareness. It's the idea of really prioritizing and making really apparent expert knowledge and supporting people to speak with confidence, whatever that sounds like and whatever accent that brings. And then that idea of code switching and the idea that can be okay and that it is a choice, but it should never be an expectation. I'd love to bring Karen in here at this point.
I think the other things that we need to consider here is that sometimes accent bias can be the thin edge of the wedge for racism, and we mustn't underplay the fact that where people feel that they can maybe get away with behaviour and it's banter and, you know, this, we're just being playful, we're being friendly, that there is this other much more sinister side to this angle. And I think we really do need to be aware of that and not just brush it away with accent bias and it's sitting in this kind of slightly less significant area. So I really do think that there is these kind of different levels, and you'll know that from your own organisations of what that can look like. But banter can quite easily create a bit of a shield for racist behaviour, and I think that's one of the things that we have to consider when we're approaching how we make change in our organisation and we support people within our organisations, that we're not actually missing some sort of clues to more significant behaviour that happens within our teams.
Yeah, absolutely, Karen. It's that idea of that signalling again, isn't it? Like it can signal other characteristics, and it can be that really quite insidious kind of I guess, intersection of different types of bias and harm that can occur. Cool. So we've kind of run through the key kind of topics, the key research points here, and we've heard some of the kind of examples from experience that Emma's shared. Emma, I'd love to just kick it to you for some final thoughts here. Like, where are you going with this next? What are your words of advice to folks who are going on this journey with you at other companies? Where would you like to leave things from the point of view of what you can give and take away from this session?
So I think one of the things I was just going to mention before we close is in the chat for the meeting, Evie has mentioned Alex Scott, and she was commentating on the World Cup for the BBC, and there was a real hoo-ha about the fact that she didn't speak BBC English. I think they were saying she was dropping her T's, just awful. I mean, if you actually listen to what she says, I think it just plays. It's a real life example of what you've just said, Lex. So she's so knowledgeable. I mean, I love football, so I love listening to her speak. I love the fact it's a woman commentating on the men's football. It makes absolutely no difference that she has a multicultural English accent, and I love the fact that she just owns it. She doesn't try to conform. She is just herself. So I think the two things that I would want to leave the group with is, if you do have an accent, own it. Be proud of, it's part of you, be proud of who you are. And the second thing, which is probably a little bit more serious, is I think we should all try and actively listen, so that we can listen to people's words and not just hear the noise that people are making. And I think if we listen to people's words, then the accent really doesn't matter, and we will start to break this accent bias.
Yeah, perfect note to end on, Emma. Absolutely. Thank you everyone for joining the call. We'll pop this up on YouTube so that people can listen after the fact, and we'll pop some resources as well for accent bias in Britain, for the Sutton Trust report, and the Social Mobility Employers Toolkit, which also has some great resources on this topic. But thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.